In the ancient Greek world, debt was a familiar part of everyday life. It was a tool, something people used to get by, to start a business, or to see them through a bad harvest. You can almost picture it: a farmer needing seed for the next season, borrowing from a wealthier neighbor with the promise of paying it back once the crop came in. In this sense, debt was a connector. It tied people together in a web of obligations and trust. It allowed for trade and for society to function, especially in a world without the sophisticated banking systems we have today. It was simply a practical necessity for keeping the wheels of the economy, however small, turning for everyone. But for all its usefulness, the Greeks were also deeply aware of debt's darker side. They saw it as a powerful and dangerous force, one that could easily spiral out of control. A simple loan to cover a family's needs could, with a bit of bad luck, become a crushing burden. For the average person, a failed crop or a sudden illness wasn't just a setback. It could be the start of a terrifying slide into ruin. This wasn't just about losing your land or your possessions. In the ancient world, the stakes were far higher. Debt had the power to strip away the most precious thing a person owned: their freedom. This tension, this idea of debt as both a helpful tool and a potential trap, sat right at the heart of how the Greeks thought about their society. It wasn't just an economic issue, it was a moral and political one. Philosophers, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens alike wrestled with the same difficult questions. What is more important? The legal right of a lender to get their money back, or the well-being and liberty of the borrower? When does a private financial agreement become a public problem? The Greeks understood that a city full of people who had lost everything to debt was not a stable or just city. It was a city on the brink of disaster. So, when we look back at ancient Greece, we find a society constantly trying to strike a balance. They needed the mechanisms of lending and borrowing to thrive, but they were terrified of what would happen if those mechanisms were allowed to run unchecked. This constant negotiation between economic necessity and social justice shaped their laws, their politics, and even their ideas about what it meant to be a good person. It's a story about money, for sure, but it's also a much bigger story about freedom, fairness, and how to build a society that works for everyone, not just the wealthy few. By the early 6th century BC, the city-state of Athens was in a terrible state. It was a society teetering on the edge of collapse, and the root cause was debt. For years, a system had developed that was devastating the city's small farmers, who were the backbone of the community. These farmers often had to borrow from the wealthy aristocracy just to survive. They would borrow grain for planting or food for their families, using their own land as collateral. It was a risky arrangement, but for many, there was simply no other choice. They were trapped in a cycle of dependency, hoping each year for a good harvest that would finally set them free. The problem was that one bad harvest was all it took to trigger a catastrophe. If a farmer couldn't pay back his loan, the wealthy lender could seize his land. This was happening all over the region of Attica, the territory surrounding Athens. A class of powerful, land-owning aristocrats was growing richer and richer, while a huge number of ordinary citizens were losing everything they had. The fields that had been in their families for generations were being swallowed up by large estates. This created a vast and growing population of landless, desperate people, which was a recipe for social unrest. Even more terrifying was what happened when a farmer had no land left to offer as collateral. In those desperate situations, the law allowed a man to pledge the one thing he had left: his own body, or the bodies of his family members. This was known as debt bondage. If he defaulted on his loan, he and his children could be forced to work as slaves for the lender until the debt was paid off, which in reality often meant forever. Some were even sold abroad into slavery, torn from their homes and their city, with no hope of ever returning. Athens was literally consuming its own citizens. This situation created a deep and bitter divide in Athenian society. On one side were the rich, who saw this as their legal right, a simple matter of enforcing a contract. On the other side were the poor, who felt they were being pushed into a state of slavery by an unjust system. The city was filled with anger and resentment. People were talking of revolution, of taking up arms and canceling all debts by force. The very fabric of the Polis, the city-state, was threatening to unravel. It was clear to everyone that something had to be done, or Athens would descend into a bloody civil war. Into this explosive situation stepped a man named Solon. Appointed as the leader of Athens around 594 BC, Solon was an aristocrat himself, but he was also known for his wisdom and his sense of fairness. He was given extraordinary powers to reform the state and pull it back from the brink. His task was to find a solution that could satisfy both the rich, who didn't want to lose all their wealth, and the poor, who were demanding relief from their crushing debts. It was a nearly impossible balancing act, but the survival of Athens depended on it. Solon knew he had to act decisively to address the root of the problem. His most famous and most radical reform was a measure called the Seisachtheia, which literally translates to the shaking off of burdens. This was a bold and sweeping act of debt cancellation. With one stroke, Solon declared all outstanding debts secured on the land, or the person to be null and void. The marker stones called horoi, which dotted the fields of Attica to show they were mortgaged, were all pulled up. This single act immediately liberated thousands of small farmers from the debts that had been slowly destroying them, allowing them to keep their land and their livelihoods. But the Seisachtheia went even further. Solon didn't just cancel existing debts. He also made it illegal for any future loan to be secured on a person's body. This was a revolutionary step. He abolished the practice of debt bondage for all Athenian citizens. No Athenian could ever again be enslaved for what they owed. He even went to the trouble of tracking down Athenians who had been sold into slavery abroad, buying them back, and bringing them home. He was, in a very real sense, restoring the citizen body of Athens, bringing people back from the social death of slavery. Of course, these reforms were not popular with everyone. The wealthy lenders were furious. They had lost a great deal of money and felt that Solon had betrayed his own class by siding with the poor. They accused him of undermining the sanctity of contracts and creating chaos. The poor, on the other hand, while grateful for the debt cancellation, had hoped for more. Many had wanted the land to be completely redistributed, taken from the rich and given to them. Solon walked a difficult middle path, trying to restore order rather than start a full-blown revolution. His goal was not to make everyone equal, but to ensure no citizen could lose their basic freedom. At the very core of Solon's reforms was a powerful and enduring idea. The freedom of the citizen is more important than the absolute enforcement of a debt contract. Solon understood that a city-state is not just an economic marketplace, it is a community of people. If that community is to be strong and stable, its members must be free. He saw that the system of debt bondage was turning Athenians against each other and hollowing out the very meaning of citizenship. A citizen who could be sold into slavery was not truly a citizen at all. Their ability to participate in the life of the Polis, to serve in the army, and to be a member of the community was extinguished. Solon's actions established a clear moral and political boundary. He essentially declared that while private property and contracts were important, they were not absolute. There were limits. Society had a right, and indeed a duty, to intervene when economic practices threatened the fundamental liberty of its people. By abolishing debt slavery, he drew a line in the sand. An Athenian's freedom was not something that could be bought or sold or used as collateral in a loan. It was an inalienable part of their identity as a member of the city-state. This was a profound shift in thinking for the ancient world. This principle had huge consequences for the future of Athens. By ensuring that the poorest citizens could not lose their freedom, Solon preserved the foundation of the Athenian army and eventually its democracy. The strength of the polis depended on having a large body of free citizens who could afford their own armor and fight as hoplite soldiers to defend the city. A city of debt slaves and landless laborers could not defend itself. Solon's reforms ensured that Athens would have the manpower it needed to survive and thrive in a dangerous world. His focus was on the long-term health of the community, not the short-term profits of a few wealthy individuals. This idea, that social cohesion and the liberty of the individual can outweigh strict financial obligations, became a cornerstone of Greek political thought. It sent a message that justice is not always found in the literal interpretation of a contract. True justice, in the eyes of reformers like Solon, involved protecting the vulnerable and ensuring the stability and freedom of the entire community. He established the precedent that when private debt creates a public crisis, the state has the right to step in and put the welfare of its citizens first. This was a radical concept that would echo through the centuries. Centuries after Solon, the great philosopher Aristotle also turned his mind to the ethics of money and debt. Writing in the 4th century BC, Aristotle had a very particular and influential view on the practice of charging interest on loans, which the Greeks called tokos. He was, deeply suspicious of it. For Aristotle, The world was organized according to natural purposes. A shoe's purpose is to be worn. A house's purpose is to provide shelter. Money, he argued, also had a natural purpose. Its function was to make the exchange of goods and services easier. It was a medium of exchange, a tool to facilitate trade, and nothing more. Based on this logic, Aristotle argued that charging interest was unnatural. He famously wrote that money itself is barren. It cannot naturally reproduce. A cow can have a calf, and a field of wheat can produce more wheat, but a pile of coins cannot give birth to more coins. Therefore, the practice of lending money and demanding more money back in the form of interest was, in his view, a perversion of money's true purpose. It was making money from money itself, which he considered to be the most unnatural form of wealth acquisition. It treated money not as a tool for exchange, but as a commodity to be bred for profit. Aristotle's concern was not just philosophical, it was also deeply social. He saw that lending at interest, especially to the poor, often led to great hardship. It was a way for the wealthy to profit from the misfortune of others. A farmer who needed a small loan to get through a tough time could find himself trapped, with the interest payments growing faster than his ability to repay the principal. This, Aristotle believed, was a form of exploitation. It created resentment and social division, pitting the interests of the lender against the well-being of the borrower, which was damaging to the harmony of the city-state. It's important to note, however, that Aristotle was not against all forms of commerce or contract. He was a practical thinker and understood that trade and business were essential parts of life in the Polis. He supported the idea of fair commercial contracts where goods and services were exchanged for a just price. His criticism was specifically aimed at the practice of usury, charging interest simply for the use of money itself, particularly when it preyed on the needy. For Aristotle, economic activity should serve the good of the community, and any practice that created wealth for some by causing misery for others was fundamentally unjust and unnatural. Socrates, the great questioner of Athens, took the discussion about debt into the realm of pure ethics. Through the writings of his student Plato, especially in the dialogue known as the Republic, we find a famous thought experiment that really challenges our everyday assumptions about justice. Socrates and his companions are trying to define what justice actually is. One of the first simple definitions proposed is that justice is simply telling the truth and paying back whatever you owe. On the surface, this sounds perfectly reasonable. It's a rule most of us are taught as children. If you borrow something, you should give it back. But Socrates, in his typical fashion, immediately shows the problem with such a simple rule. He presents a hypothetical scenario. Imagine you have borrowed a weapon from a friend. Later, your friend goes mad and comes back demanding his weapon. According to the simple definition of justice, you should pay your debt and give the weapon back to him. After all, it belongs to him, and you promised to return it. It is what you owe him. This is the letter of the law, the strict enforcement of the agreement you made when you borrowed the item. However, Socrates points out that everyone would agree that giving a weapon to a madman would be a terrible and unjust act. It would almost certainly lead to harm, maybe even murder. In this case, following the simple rule of paying your debts would result in a great injustice. So, Socrates concludes, justice cannot be as simple as always paying back what you owe. True justice requires something more. It requires wisdom, context, and a consideration of the consequences of your actions. It means you have to think about what is genuinely the right and good thing to do in a particular situation. This Socratic argument has profound implications for how we think about debt. It suggests that the moral obligation to repay a debt is not absolute. There can be circumstances where rigidly enforcing repayment would actually be the wrong thing to do because it would cause significant harm. This way of thinking aligns perfectly with the spirit of Solon's reforms. Solon recognized that forcing the Athenian people to repay their debts to the point of slavery was causing immense harm to the community as a whole. Like in Socrates' example, sticking to the letter of the contract was leading to a greater injustice. True justice required a more flexible and humane approach. Throughout the ancient Greek world, from Athens to Sparta and beyond, one of the most feared social conditions was something called stasis. The word means something like civil strife, internal conflict, or factional paralysis. It was what happened when a city-state turned on itself, when citizens were locked in a bitter struggle against other citizens. Greek thinkers saw stasis as the ultimate political disease. a state of near civil war that could destroy a polis from within. And one of the most common and powerful triggers for this dreaded condition was widespread private debt. The conflict between debtors and creditors was a classic recipe for tearing a city apart. History gives us many examples. Before Solon's reforms, Athens was on the verge of stasis precisely because of the debt crisis. The poor were ready to take up arms, and the rich were prepared to defend their property. This same dynamic played out in other city-states. When a large portion of the population felt that the economic system was fundamentally unjust and was pushing them into poverty and servitude, their loyalty to the state began to crumble. They saw the laws not as a source of justice, but as a tool used by the rich to oppress them. This created a fertile ground for demagogues and tyrants who promised to cancel debts and redistribute land. In a fascinating way, this constant threat of debt-fueled rebellion actually helped push some Greek cities towards more democratic forms of government. The ruling elites began to realize that ignoring the plight of the poor was not a sustainable strategy. To prevent stasis, they had to make concessions. Solon's reforms in Athens are a perfect example. While not a full democracy at first, his changes gave more power to ordinary citizens and protected them from the worst excesses of aristocratic rule. By canceling debts and ending debt bondage, he eased the social tensions and created a more inclusive political community. This process continued over time. The establishment of democracy in Athens gave the common people, the demos, a real voice in government. This meant they could use their political power to protect their economic interests. The assembly could vote on laws concerning contracts, interest rates, and debt relief. The memory of the pre-Solonian crisis was long, and Athenians remained wary of allowing debt to get out of control again. Democracy became, in part, a defense mechanism for the poor, a way to ensure that the laws would not be used to dispossess and enslave them. The struggle for economic justice and the struggle for political freedom were really two sides of the same coin. While the Greeks were intensely focused on the moral and political problems caused by private debt between citizens, the concept of state debt as we know it today was less of a central concern. Greek city-states, the Polis, did of course borrow money. They might take out loans from wealthy individuals or even from the sacred treasuries of temples, like the Parthenon in Athens, to fund wars or large public works projects. For example, Athens famously used borrowed funds to build its massive fleet of warships that proved crucial in defeating the Persian invasion. This was seen as a practical necessity for the survival and glory of the state. However, the moral anxiety was directed elsewhere. The primary ethical focus was not on whether the state could pay back its lenders, but on how economic policies affected the well-being of the citizen body. The health of the polis was judged by the health of its people. A city where citizens were free, self-sufficient, and able to participate in public life was considered a successful city. A city where citizens were losing their land, falling into bondage, and living in misery was seen as a failed state, no matter how wealthy its temples or how grand its public buildings were. The ultimate goal was to maintain social harmony and protect the citizenry. This priority system is the complete opposite of what we often see in modern economic discussions, where the credibility of a government is frequently tied to its unwavering commitment to repaying its sovereign debt, sometimes at great social cost. For the Greeks, the state's credibility was tied to its ability to protect its citizens from ruin. A good lawmaker or ruler was one who, like Solon, put the freedom and stability of the community ahead of the abstract principle of debt repayment. The idea of imposing harsh austerity measures that would drive citizens into poverty in order to repay a temple treasury would have seemed bizarre and self-defeating to them. This mindset shows a fundamental belief that the economy should serve the people, not the other way around. The state's role was to manage affairs in a way that prevented the kind of extreme wealth inequality and widespread desperation that led to stasis. This meant that public policy could and should be used to regulate lending, control interest, and, in extreme cases, cancel debts. The ultimate debt the state owed was not to its financial creditors, but to its own people, a debt of ensuring their freedom, security, and ability to live a decent life as members of the political community. It might seem strange to look back over 2,500 years to ancient Greece for answers to our modern financial problems. After all, our global economy of digital transactions and complex financial instruments is a world away from the farmers of ancient Attica borrowing grain. And yet, the fundamental questions the Greeks wrestled with are, honestly, startlingly relevant today. The tension between the rights of creditors and the welfare of debtors, the danger of debt leading to social unrest, and the debate over the government's role in regulating the economy are all issues that dominate our headlines. When we talk today about student loan forgiveness, mortgage relief for struggling homeowners, or the sovereign debt crises facing entire nations, we're really having the same conversation Solon had in Athens. We are asking, at what point does a private debt become a public problem? What is the greater good? Is it to uphold the letter of every contract, no matter the human cost? Or is it to prioritize social stability and the well-being of our citizens, even if it means intervening in private financial arrangements? The Greek experience serves as a powerful reminder that these are not new problems. Aristotle's critique of making money from money, his warning against unnatural forms of wealth creation, also finds an echo in modern debates about finance. His arguments make us question the purpose of our economic system. Is it simply to generate maximum profit for those with capital, or should it be geared towards fostering a just and stable society? When we see complex financial products that seem disconnected from the real economy of goods and services causing global instability, we are witnessing a modern version of the barren money that Aristotle found so troubling. He prompts us to ask what our economy is really for. Ultimately, the most enduring lesson from the ancient Greeks is that the economy is not a force of nature that exists outside of our moral and political lives. It is a human creation, and it should be structured to serve human ends. The Greeks teach us that freedom is more than just the absence of political tyranny. It is also freedom from the kind of economic desperation that robs people of their dignity and their future. Their radical decision to place the liberty and stability of the community above the absolute right of debt repayment is a piece of ancient wisdom that we would do well to remember in our own turbulent times.